Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at a topic that's, well, honestly, it's one that's pretty close to home for a lot of us, and something I know we've all been thinking about, especially over the last year or so.
Genau.
It's Western companies and how they're dealing with doing business in Russia in light of, well, everything that's going on over there. So, to help us really get into the finer points here, we're looking at a report from B4 Ukraine. Now, if you haven't heard of them, they're a coalition that's advocating for, just a full financial and material disconnect from Russia. And they did a big investigation into Western corporations and their, financial ties to Russia. And one of the things that really jumped out at me, and I think will jump out at you too, is that between 2022 and 2023, Western multinationals ended up paying this $41.6 billion in taxes to the Russian government.
Wow.
Yeah, and to put that into perspective, that's almost a third of Russia's entire projected military budget for 2025. So, it really begs the question, are these companies, even if they don't mean to, basically helping to finance a war?
Well, it's a complicated issue, and I think a lot of people assume that after the invasion, most Western companies just packed up and left.
Yeah.
But that's not really what happened.
Oh, really? I have to admit, I kind of just assumed that most companies would have left by now, so what are the numbers looking like?
Yeah, so this report looked at 1,599 companies that had operations in Russia at the beginning of 2022, and only 28% have actually fully exited.
So that means that over 70% are still there. I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around why a company would stay in, a place that is not only volatile, but also ethically, you know, well, questionable to be doing business in.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head when you say ethically questionable, because that's really the crux of it, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, the reasons why companies stay are complex, but there's no denying that finances play a huge role in this.
And that's really where this report gets interesting, right? Because they went really deep into the whole financial side of it.
Absolutely, and the numbers are pretty staggering. Just in 2023 alone, Western companies operating in Russia generated $196.9 billion in revenue, and that translated to $21.6 billion in taxes paid to the Russian government.
Okay, so we're not talking about small potatoes here. And the report highlights that American and German companies are some of the top contributors here, which is interesting because, aren't those countries the ones who are leading the support for Ukraine?
Right.
So isn't that kind of a contradiction?
Yeah, and that's something that the report highlights really well, is that there's this real disconnect between government policies and the actions of corporations. And, sanctions are meant to, put pressure on Russia, but a lot of businesses find ways to work around them and continue operating,
Okay.
you know?
Yeah, that makes sense. So which sectors are we mainly talking about here? Like what kind of companies are contributing to these huge sums of money?
Well, the biggest one, and the one that probably impacts our listeners the most, is the fast-moving consumer goods sector, or FMCG. And we're talking about companies like Mars, Nestle, Procter& and Gamble.
Oh, so those are like, our everyday products.
Exactly, the things you use every day.
And like my chocolate bar or my coffee or shampoo. And those are all contributing to this.
Yeah, pretty much. And then right behind the FMCG sector, you have the finance and automotive industries.
So some pretty big players across the board. Okay, so it's clear that these companies are making a lot of money in Russia, but I imagine there's a lot of pressure on them to, pull out completely. So what are they saying to justify staying?
Well, a lot of these companies are arguing that by staying in Russia, they're actually benefiting the Russian people. They're providing essential goods and services, and they often highlight their humanitarian aid contributions to Ukraine as well.
So they're kind of framing it as, a humanitarian effort, even though there are clear financial gains. I mean, do you think that argument really holds up?
Well, it's certainly a point of contention. Critics argue that while these humanitarian efforts are positive, they're completely dwarfed by the scale of the financial contributions that these companies are making to the Russian government.
So it could be seen as more of a PR move than, genuine ethical responsibility.
Yeah, I think that's a perspective that a lot of people share. It's all about finding that balance between making a profit and, appearing to be sensitive to what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely a tough balancing act. Now, the report also mentions something called waronomics. Can you explain what that is? And how does it relate to Western companies?
So waronomics is basically how Russia is using its economy to, fuel its war efforts. It's like a big machine. And these companies are kind of supplying the fuel, even if they don't intend to.
Oh, wow. And how do Western companies factor into that?
Well, this is where it gets even trickier. because Russia's planning to increase its corporate tax rate from 20% to 25% in 2025. And this is expected to generate a lot of revenue for the government. And a lot of that revenue will be coming from, well, the Western companies that chose to stay.
So it's like they're getting even more financially entangled in this conflict. It really makes you think, are profits being put ahead of human rights?
Yeah, it's a tough question.
Right.
And there are valid arguments on both sides.
I mean, on one hand, if these companies leave, there's the potential for job losses, disruptions in essential goods, and, economic hardship for everyday Russians. But on the other hand, there's this moral obligation to not, support a regime that's doing terrible things. So yeah, it's a very complicated situation.
What do you think our listeners should be thinking about as they process all of this? It's definitely a lot to unpack. Yeah, it really is. And it boils down to this, classic conflict between what companies want and what's, ethically right. Companies obviously want to make as much money as possible for their shareholders, but they also have to operate in a world where doing the right thing is becoming more and more important.
And that's what I find so interesting about this whole thing, right? It's not just about the money. It's about, these really big moral questions about what companies should do when there's a war going on. It's about finding that balance between, making a profit and actually doing the right thing.
Yeah, and finding that balance is really hard, especially in this situation
Yeah.
with so many different things to consider.
So after reading this report and having this conversation, what would you say is the biggest takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
Well, the report really pushes Western companies to look at what they're doing and make sure it's, in line with human rights and all of that. But is that really enough?
That's a big question.
It's not just about corporations, though, right? It's about what we do as individuals. Consumers have a lot of power. They can choose to support companies that, align with their values.
So are you saying that people should boycott these companies?
Well, boycotts are one way to, send a message and put pressure on these companies, but it's not always that simple.
Yeah, I mean, boycotts can have, unintended consequences. What about the people who work for those companies? They could lose their jobs.
Exactly. It's a complex issue, and I think the most important thing is to stay informed and, really think about where you spend your money and who you're supporting.
Yeah, it's like we've gone full circle here. We started by looking at the money, then the ethical side of things, and now it's about, what we can actually do about it.
And ultimately, each person has to decide what they're going to do with this information.
Exactly. And for those who want to dig deeper, we'll be sure to link to the full Before Ukraine report in the show notes. It is a bit of a long read, but it's packed with some really interesting stuff.
Yeah. I would say it's essential reading for anyone who wants to really understand all the nuances of this situation.
Well said. All right, well, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. I hope this was insightful and maybe even a little thought-provoking.
Yeah, and we encourage everyone to keep thinking about these issues and, come to your own conclusions.
Because ultimately, the goal here isn't just to give you information, it's to empower you to make informed decisions. And remember, this conversation doesn't end here. We'd love to hear your thoughts on social media, so feel free to reach out and let us know what you think.
Yeah, because having these conversations is how we can actually start to make a difference.
Very true. And on that note, we've come to the end of our deep dive into Western companies and Russia. I hope you all learned something new and that this has given you some food for thought.
And remember, knowledge is just the first step. It's what we do with that knowledge that really matters.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and remember your choices make a difference. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep. It's kind of crazy to think about, right? Like how something so big and complicated can actually be connected to, our everyday choices.
Yeah, it's easy to feel disconnected from these global issues.
But when you think about it, choosing, a certain brand of coffee or clothes or even a car, it all ties back to these bigger systems.
Absolutely, and we often underestimate how much power we have as consumers.
But when we all start making more conscious choices, it can actually make a difference. And I think that's really the whole point of what we do here at the Deep Dives. We want to give you the knowledge and the different perspectives so you can make more informed decisions in a world that's, pretty complicated.
It's about asking the right questions and having those tough conversations and then actually doing something with what we learn.
Exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into, this whole Western companies and Russia thing, I'm curious, what's the one thing you hope our listeners take away from this?
Well, for me, it's realizing that we're not just, bystanders in all of this. We're all connected in some way, and our choices matter. whether it's, doing research on the companies we support or talking about ethical business practices
Mm-mm.
or just, amplifying the voice of the people who are calling for change. We all have a role to play.
That's a great point, and I think it's a perfect way to end our conversation today. We encourage you to keep learning and keep asking questions. And remember, your choices have power. So until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.